The courtroom hummed with a tense, almost suffocating silence. Patricia Albright, head of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, sat at the defense table, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and sharp suit usually giving her an air of unshakable authority. Today, however, her face was a ghostly white, her eyes wide and fixed on the large, detailed map unrolled before the judge. Beside her, the HOA's legal team, usually so smug and self-assured, looked like startled deer caught in headlights. "Your Honor," I stated, my voice calm but firm, "the evidence is irrefutable. As this survey, commissioned by my legal team and independently verified, clearly shows, the entire Willow Creek Estates development, comprising 75 homes, plus their community center and decorative ponds, sits directly on land that has been in my family for over a century. My land, not theirs." A collective gasp rippled through the spectators, mostly the homeowners themselves, who had flocked to witness what they thought would be my swift defeat. Their perfectly manicured lawns, their shiny new cars parked in their driveways, their dreams of suburban bliss, all of it, built upon my grandfather's cherished fields and forests. The air crackled with disbelief, then a rising tide of panic. Patricia Albright's jaw hung slightly open, her usual condescending smirk replaced by an expression of utter horror. She had called me a nuisance and a holdout for years, refusing to sell what she believed was just an inconvenient patch of undeveloped dirt. Now, her grand vision, her sprawling empire of identical houses, was teetering on a precipice. The Willow Creek Estates, a monument to her ambition, was about to become a very expensive, very illegal, very stuck-in-my-legal-web mess. How could they have made such a colossal mistake? The question hung in the air, thick and heavy, as the judge adjusted his glasses, a slow, thoughtful frown creasing his brow, and the full weight of the bombshell dropped. It wasn't always like this battle over land and pride. My life, until recently, had been a quiet symphony of rustling leaves, chirping crickets, and the gentle gurgle of the stream that wound through my property. My name is Alex, and my home was a small, sturdy farmhouse that had stood for generations on the very edge of what the town map vaguely referred to as the undeveloped southern parcel. To me, it was simply the land. It was where my grandparents, bless their kind souls, had taught me to identify every bird by its song and every tree by its bark. My grandmother, Sarah, with her hands smelling of freshly baked bread and garden soil, used to say, "Alex, this land, it's not just dirt and trees. It's a living thing. It breathes, it remembers. Treat it with kindness, and it will give you everything you need." My grandfather, David, a man of few words but deep wisdom, would often just sit on the porch swing with me, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, and whisper, "Some things are worth holding on to, boy. Some things are priceless." Their words were etched into my heart, forming the very bedrock of my existence. After they passed, the land became my sanctuary, my responsibility, my legacy. I lived a simple life. I worked odd jobs in town, mostly carpentry and some landscaping, just enough to keep the old farmhouse in good repair and pay the taxes. My days were filled with long walks through the woods, fishing in the stream, and tending to a small vegetable patch. I often thought about what my grandparents would want me to do with it. They never had much money, but they had this vast expanse of nature, and they treasured it above all else. They instilled in me a deep love for the environment, a belief that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in the health of the earth around you and the peace in your heart. I always imagined one day I'd find a way to share its beauty, maybe a small nature preserve, or a community garden, something that honored its spirit rather than destroying it. I truly believe that kindness extended not just to people, but to the world we inhabit. Every decision I made about the land was filtered through that lens. Would this decision bring more peace, more life, more kindness to this place? The first whispers of change came subtly, like a distant rumble of thunder on a clear day. New roads started appearing further north, connecting to the highway, bringing more traffic. Then came the signs. Future home of Willow Creek Estates, boasting luxury living and spacious lots. I saw them crop up along the main roads, closer and closer to my quiet corner of the world. At first, they felt like a distant threat, like someone else's problem. My land was vast, encompassing nearly 80 acres, mostly undeveloped. Surely, they wouldn't come all the way out here. Sometimes, a sleek, expensive SUV would drive slowly down the dusty road that bordered one side of my property, slowing down, occupants peering out with assessing eyes. I'd just wave, a friendly but clear message, "This is home." Most times, they'd wave back, sometimes with a polite, curious smile, sometimes with a blank stare. I learned to recognize the distinct glint of expensive real estate brochures on their dashboards. I even had a few unexpected visitors, usually well-dressed men and women who would knock on my door, offering to discuss the future of the area. I'd politely decline, explaining that the land wasn't for sale, not now, not ever. They'd nod, a little surprised, but usually respectful. My closest neighbor was a sweet, elderly lady named Mrs. Gable, who lived in a charming, slightly run-down house a few miles down the road. She'd lived there even longer than my grandparents. We often shared fresh vegetables from our gardens and stories from days gone by. Mrs. Gable worried about the developments too. "It's all changing, Alex," she'd say, shaking her head. "This quiet life, it's fading away." Her words always echoed my own fears, but we both held on to the hope that some things, like our deep connection to the land, would remain untouched. We'd talk about how people rushed around so much these days, forgetting to appreciate the simple things, forgetting to be kind to each other, and to the earth. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a hum, louder and more insistent than any I'd ever heard, woke me before dawn. It wasn't the sound of a distant tractor or a logging truck. This was a deep, guttural roar, closer than anything had ever been. I threw on a jacket and boots, my heart thumping a strange, uneasy rhythm against my ribs. As I stepped out onto the porch, the air was still cool and smelled of damp earth and pine, but it was now tainted with the harsh tang of diesel fuel. Following the insistent roar, I walked towards the eastern edge of my property, where the thick woods met an old, almost forgotten logging trail. My stomach clenched tighter with every step. Rounding a bend in the trail, I stopped dead in my tracks. A massive yellow bulldozer sat on the edge of a newly cleared patch of ground. Trees that had stood for decades lay in tangled heaps, their fresh-cut wounds stark against the green undergrowth. The land around them was churned earth, raw and exposed. And the machine, still running, its engine idling loudly, was unmistakably on my side of the old, barely visible property line markers. A burly man in a hard hat climbed down from the driver's seat, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at me with an indifferent gaze. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking a little despite my attempt to sound firm. "What are you doing? You're on my land." He barely spared me a glance. "Nah, buddy, this ain't your land. This is the new Willow Creek Estates, Phase 1. You must be confused. We got the surveys, the permits, everything." He gestured vaguely with a calloused hand towards the torn-up earth, then turned back towards his machine, as if my presence was nothing more than an annoying fly. My confusion quickly turned to a cold, hard anger. They were not just encroaching, they were dismissing me, claiming what was mine with such casual arrogance. This wasn't a mistake, it felt like a deliberate act, a clear message: we are taking over, and you can't stop us. The hum of the bulldozer grew louder as the man climbed back into its seat, its giant blade already lowering, ready to devour more of my beloved woods. I stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the very ground beneath my feet, the land I had sworn to protect, began to tremble under the relentless might of their machine. It was a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, the true beginning of the war for my land. The roaring bulldozer, a monstrous yellow beast, lurched forward, its massive blade tearing into the earth just inches from where I stood. Dirt and splintered wood chips flew into the air, forcing me to stumble back, coughing. The driver, a burly man with a baseball cap pulled low, didn't even glance my way. He just kept pushing, carving a raw, ugly path through the undergrowth, deep into what I knew was my property. My heart pounded like a drum against my ribs, a mix of pure adrenaline and white-hot anger. This wasn't just an intrusion, it felt like an invasion, a deliberate act of disrespect for everything my family had built and protected for generations. "Stop!" I yelled again, louder this time, my voice raw. "You have to stop. This is private property." The driver finally looked up, his eyes shielded by dark sunglasses. He leaned out of the cab, a smirk playing on his lips. "Listen, kid," he drawled, his voice thick with condescension, "I'm just doing my job. This whole area's been zoned for development. Willow Creek Estates. You ever heard of it? Big plans. You're standing where a brand new clubhouse is going to be. Best you step aside before you get hurt." He pointed a gloved finger towards the distant, perfectly manicured entrance of what was already phase 1 of the development. "Go on, now. We got a schedule to keep." He revved the engine, the roar swelling, and I had to jump back as the blade scraped forward once more. It was clear he wasn't going to stop. He believed he was on his rightful ground, or at least, he acted like it. I stood there, watching in horrified silence as more trees fell, more earth was churned. My mind raced. What could I do? Call the police? They'd just tell me it was a civil matter. Show him my property deeds? He clearly didn't care. It was like shouting into a hurricane. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the bulldozer finally stopped, the driver getting out to inspect his work. He pulled out a small, rolled-up blueprint, glancing between it and the ravaged land. I stood my ground, trembling with a fury I rarely felt. This wasn't just about trees. It was about my home, my family's history, and the quiet promise I'd made to my grandparents. "I'm warning you," I finally managed to say, my voice low and shaky with contained rage. "You are trespassing. You are destroying my property. You will regret this." The man chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. Yeah, heard it all before. Go home, kid. Before you cause any real trouble." He waved me off, then turned his back and walked over to another section of the newly cleared land. I knew arguing with him further was useless. He was just a worker, following orders. The real problem was whoever had given those orders, whoever truly believed this land was theirs to destroy. I turned and walked away, my legs feeling like lead, the deafening roar of the bulldozer echoing in my ears, a cruel symphony marking the beginning of the end for my peaceful life. The next few weeks felt like living under a dark cloud. The bulldozer incident had been a jarring wake-up call, but it was only the first rumbling of a much larger storm. Each morning, I'd wake to the distant, mechanical groan of heavy machinery. Sometimes, it was bulldozers. Other times, it was dump trucks rumbling down the old logging trail, carrying away massive loads of timber. The air, once so clean and crisp, now carried the faint scent of diesel and freshly disturbed earth. The harmony of bird calls was often drowned out by the metallic clang of construction. It was a slow, agonizing siege on my senses, and on my soul. I spent hours poring over old maps and property deeds, documents that had been passed down through my family, carefully stored in a dusty wooden chest in the attic. My grandfather, David, had been meticulous, keeping every receipt, every survey marker, every official paper relating to the land. I found ancient plat maps, some dating back to the late 1800s, with hand-drawn lines showing the exact boundaries of our property. Then there were the more recent surveys from the 1950s and 1980s, all clearly marking my 80 acres, bounded by the winding stream to the west, the old county road to the north, and a series of ancient oak trees to the east and south. My land was unique. It wasn't a perfect rectangle or square. The boundaries were irregular, following natural contours, stream beds, and old fence lines. This meant the property lines weren't always obvious to someone just looking at a modern, simplified map. I suspected this complexity was part of the problem. Perhaps the developers, in their rush to build, had relied on incomplete or flawed information. Or perhaps, a more cynical part of me thought, they simply didn't care. My hope was that it was a genuine mistake, something that could be fixed with a few clear conversations and a stack of undeniable documents. I wanted to believe that if I could just show them the truth, the kindness that my grandparents had embodied, they would understand and stop. I hated confrontation, preferring to solve problems with understanding and empathy, and I tried to approach this with that same mindset, even as my anxiety mounted. I attempted to contact the Willow Creek Estates development company. I called the number listed on their sales brochures, which I'd picked up from a mailbox near the growing construction site. Each time, I was met with automated menus, endless holding music, and eventually, a brisk, disinterested receptionist who would promise to pass on my message to the relevant department. My calls were never returned. I even tried visiting their temporary sales office, a gleaming modular building set up near the entrance of the already completed first phase of homes. I waited for over an hour, watching prospective homeowners tour model houses, their faces alight with excitement. Finally, a stern-faced woman with a headset, presumably a sales manager, approached me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but clearly signaling she was busy. I explained, as calmly as I could, about the bulldozer, about my property lines, about my concerns. I even pulled out a copy of one of my old survey maps. She barely glanced at it. "Sir, I assure you, all our development is done legally, with proper permits and surveys. If you have a property dispute, that's a legal matter, not something our sales team can address. You'll need to contact our corporate legal department, but I can't give you that number. You'll have to go through the proper channels." She handed me a glossy brochure with a general customer service email address. It was a polite dismissal, a wall of corporate bureaucracy designed to deflect and frustrate. It became clear that approaching this with kindness and a simple explanation wasn't going to work. My attempts at peaceful resolution were being met with indifference and a stonewall. The bulldozers kept coming. The sound was now a constant, grating presence. Not just during the day, but sometimes even late into the evening, bright spotlights illuminating the tearing of earth. I saw roads being carved, foundations poured. Houses started to sprout up, rows of them, like mushrooms after a rain. They were quick, efficient, and relentless. It wasn't just the eastern side of my property anymore. I started seeing survey markers, those flimsy orange flags on metal sticks, appearing further south, then even to the west, closer and closer to my actual farmhouse. They were moving in, surrounding me. It felt like watching a slow-motion invasion, and I was utterly helpless. The stream, which had always been so clear, began to run muddy after heavy rains, carrying sediment from the construction. The wildlife, once abundant, grew scarcer. The birds that used to fill the morning air with their songs were now few and far between. The peaceful symphony of nature was being replaced by the cacophony of construction. One afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my property, trying to understand how far the encroachment had gone. My heart sank with every step. The development wasn't just creeping towards my boundaries, it had outright breached them in multiple places. Roads were laid where old forest paths used to be. A small cul-de-sac, complete with newly planted saplings and a gleaming street sign that read Willow Bend Way, was clearly built across what my grandfather's map identified as our lower pasture. The thought of it made me sick. They weren't building near my land, they were building on it. But the sheer scale of the operation, the number of houses taking shape, made it hard to grasp. It was like a nightmare. Then, about 2 months after the first bulldozer incident, a new development began, even closer to my house. It was going to be the community center for Willow Creek Estates, a large building with a swimming pool and tennis courts. I watched from a distance as they cleared the land for it, the sounds of their machines echoing right through my windows. I kept telling myself, it's fine, it's still far enough. But one day, I saw a crew installing fences. Not property fences, but decorative, white picket fences that seemed to define the edges of the future community center grounds. I walked out, my heart pounding, hoping it was just a temporary marker. But as I got closer, I saw it. One section of the new white picket fence, shiny and stark against the natural landscape, was not just on my land, but actually curving around one of my oldest, most cherished oak trees, a tree my grandfather had planted when I was born. It was a tree that marked a specific, indisputable corner of my property. They hadn't just built near it, they had encircled it, claiming it as their own, effectively cutting off a small, significant portion of my land and incorporating it into their development. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, mournful shadows across the desecrated landscape, a large, official-looking sign was hammered into the ground beside the newly installed fence. It was a big, fancy sign, the kind with polished wood and elegant lettering. It read, Willow Creek Estates Community Center, opening soon. Beneath it, in smaller print, were the names of the developers, the contractors, and, to my utter disbelief, the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, prominently displayed. This wasn't just a construction crew's mistake anymore. This was a direct, blatant claim of ownership over my land, sanctioned by the very people who would eventually live in these homes. It was a declaration of war. My blood ran cold, a terrifying realization washing over me. They knew. Or they thought they did. They thought this was their land. And they were building not just one, but 75 homes, plus an entire community hub, on it. The sheer audacity, the magnitude of their error, or perhaps their deliberate deception, was truly horrifying. The sight of that polished sign, emblazoned with the words, Willow Creek Estates Community Center, directly beside my grandfather's ancient oak, felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a sign, it was a brazen declaration. They weren't just encroaching, they were taking, openly and without apology. The initial shock quickly morphed into a cold, determined resolve. This was no longer a misunderstanding that could be fixed with polite conversations and dusty maps. This was a battle, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would fight for every inch of my family's land. The kind, empathetic approach I had hoped to employ was clearly not going to work. They had crossed a line. My first step was to find a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who understood property law inside and out, someone who wasn't afraid to take on a big development company and an established HOA. This was easier said than done. Most local lawyers I called seemed hesitant, some even outright dismissive. Taking on Willow Creek Estates, Mr. Alex? That's a powerful group, one attorney said, his voice laced with caution. Another advised, perhaps it's time to consider selling. They'll likely offer you a good price, given the circumstances. Each rejection, each subtle suggestion to give up, only fueled my determination. My grandparents hadn't preserved this land for a century just for me to fold at the first sign of trouble. This land was not just property, it was a part of me, a part of my family's soul, and its value was far beyond any price. After weeks of searching, I finally found her, Jessica Riley. Her office was small, nestled in an old brick building downtown, far from the gleaming high-rises where the corporate lawyers worked. Jessica was a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a reputation for being relentless, especially when it came to defending the underdog. When I laid out my story, showing her my stack of deeds, maps, and the infuriating photos of their community center sign next to my oak tree, her expression shifted from professional attentiveness to a look of quiet disbelief, then a growing fire in her eyes. So, let me get this straight, Alex, she said, leaning forward across her cluttered desk, a slight smile playing on her lips. They've built 75 homes and a community center, not just adjacent to your land, but on it? And they claim to have all the proper permits? That's right, I confirmed, and they won't even talk to me. She chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Oh, they'll talk to you now. Or rather, they'll talk to us. This is astonishing. If these documents are accurate, Mr. Alex, they've made a colossal mistake. Or committed a very serious fraud. She spread my oldest plat map on her desk, tracing the intricate lines with a slender finger. The original surveys, the meets and bounds descriptions, these are ironclad. This land has clearly defined historical boundaries. Hiring Jessica wasn't cheap. My savings, modest as they were, started to dwindle quickly. But I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in months. She immediately sent a sternly worded letter to Willow Creek Estates corporate offices, detailing my claims and demanding that all construction cease immediately. The response was predictably swift and dismissive, a form letter from their legal department, stating that their surveys were impeccable, all permits were in order, and that my claims were without merit and frivolous. They even threatened to countersue me for harassment and delaying their project. It was a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate me into giving up, but with Jessica by my side, I felt a new strength. They're trying to scare you off, Alex, Jessica explained, her voice calm. This is standard practice for large developers. They expect you to fold. But we won't. She immediately moved to file a preliminary injunction with the court, a legal request to halt all construction on the disputed land until the property lines could be definitively settled. This was the first major legal move, and it felt incredibly significant. The day the court papers were served to the development company and the HOA, I imagined the chaos it would cause in their offices. Finally, they would have to acknowledge me. While the legal wheels slowly began to turn, the construction, though perhaps slowing in some areas, did not entirely stop. I still heard the sounds of hammers and saws, the rumble of concrete mixers. It was clear they were pushing ahead, either confident in their own claims or hoping the injunction would be denied. The sight of new homes springing up, brick by brick, on land I knew was mine, was a constant torment. It felt like watching a thief build a mansion with your own stolen bricks, right in front of your eyes. My once peaceful walks through the woods were now exercises in monitoring the damage. I documented everything. New fences, freshly dug ditches, even the planting of decorative shrubs and trees that were clearly meant to be permanent fixtures of the new neighborhood. I took countless photos and videos, noting the exact locations, cross-referencing them with my maps. Jessica had advised me to become a meticulous record keeper, to gather every piece of evidence. I even bought a high-quality drone to capture aerial shots, showing the sprawling development eating into my untouched forest, revealing the terrifying scale of the encroachment. From above, it was chillingly clear how much of my land was being swallowed. The small community around me, the one that had once been so quiet and friendly, began to change. As more houses were completed in Willow Creek Estates, more families moved in. Most of them were new to the area, unaware of the quiet life that had existed before. Some seemed nice enough, waving as I drove by. Others, however, seemed to carry an air of entitlement, a sense that their new, pristine neighborhood was superior. The casual courtesy that had once existed was replaced by a subtle tension. One afternoon, I was out near the eastern edge of my property, inspecting some new drainage pipes that had been installed, clearly designed to redirect rainwater from the new homes onto what they thought was their land, but was in fact, my low-lying meadow. I was carrying my old, tattered copy of my grandfather's survey map. Suddenly, a sleek, black luxury car pulled up on the newly paved road that now bordered my land. The window rolled down, revealing the face of Patricia Albright, the very head of the HOA. She was even more impeccably dressed than she had been in my brief glimpse of her at the sales office, her hair and makeup flawless. She was looking at me with an expression that was a mix of annoyance and disdain. "You're Alex, aren't you?" she stated rather than asked, her voice sharp and condescending. The one causing all this trouble with the development? I nodded, gripping my map tighter. And you must be Ms. Albright. I'm not causing trouble. I'm protecting my property. She scoffed, a dismissive sound. Your property, as you call it, is nothing but a nuisance. An unkempt patch of trees and weeds standing in the way of progress. We have a beautiful community being built here, with families and amenities. Do you have any idea how much this injunction is costing us? Thousands, Mr. Alex. Thousands, every single day, because of your stubbornness. Her eyes narrowed. I suggest you drop this foolish lawsuit. You'll never win against us. We have the best lawyers money can buy, and we have the town council's full support. We checked all the maps. This land is ours. It always has been. With all due respect, Ms. Albright, I countered, trying to keep my voice steady, my maps, and more importantly, the official records, say otherwise. This land has been in my family for over 100 years. That oak tree right there? I pointed to the ancient oak, its branches heavy with leaves, standing resolute despite the new fence encircling it. My grandfather planted that when I was born. It marks our boundary. Your community center, your homes, they're on my land. She merely laughed, a cold, hard sound that sent a shiver down my spine. That's quaint, Mr. Alex, but sentimental stories don't win legal battles. We have certified surveys. You're living in the past. This is the future. And the future of this area is Willow Creek Estates. You're just a relic, and you're holding up everything. She paused, her gaze sweeping over my worn clothes and the old farmhouse visible in the distance. Look, we're willing to be generous. We'll offer you a fair price for your parcel. Consider it an offer of goodwill. It's more than it's worth, honestly. Take the money, move somewhere else, and let us build our community in peace. Her words, delivered with such an air of superiority, ignited a new spark of defiance within me. They weren't just taking my land, they were insulting my family, my heritage, my way of life. This wasn't about money for me, it was about respect, about justice, about the promise I made to my grandparents. Ms. Albright, I said, my voice now firm, this land is not for sale. Not at any price. And I won't be intimidated by you or your best lawyers. I have my own. And she's very good. Her face hardened, her previous dismissive amusement vanishing, replaced by a steely anger. You'll regret this, Alex. We are the Homeowners Association. We represent 75 families. We have resources you can't even imagine. And we will not allow one stubborn individual to stand in the way of our community's prosperity. This will become very unpleasant for you, very quickly. She gave me one last, withering stare, then rolled up her window with a definitive hum. The car sped away, leaving me standing alone by the encroached oak tree, the dust from its tires settling on my face. Her threat hung in the air, cold and clear. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was personal. And I was about to find out just how unpleasant things could get. Patricia Albright's threat, delivered with such icy conviction, echoed in my mind long after her luxury car vanished down the new asphalt road. This will become very unpleasant for you, very quickly. I knew she wasn't just bluffing. The HOA, with its deep pockets and influential connections, clearly saw me as an obstacle to be removed, not a legitimate landowner with valid claims. This wasn't just about property lines anymore, it was a test of wills, a David and Goliath struggle. The unpleasantness began subtly at first. My mail, which usually arrived without a hitch, started becoming inconsistent. Bills were delayed, important legal documents from Jessica were missing, and sometimes I'd receive mail clearly meant for someone else, with addresses from the new Willow Creek Estates homes. It was frustrating, forcing me to make extra trips to the post office and constantly chase down important papers. I tried to report it, but the post office just shrugged, blaming new addresses in the area causing confusion. Then came the noise. Not the construction noise, which was constant, but a different kind of noise. Late at night, sometimes just after midnight, loud music would suddenly blare from somewhere within the new development, bass thumping through the quiet night, loud enough to rattle my windows. It wasn't constant, but it was unpredictable, just enough to disrupt my sleep, leaving me groggy and on edge each morning. Sometimes, cars would drive slowly down the old logging trail that bordered my land, their headlights sweeping across my farmhouse, lingering a little too long before moving on. It felt like I was being watched, monitored. It was unsettling, making me feel isolated and vulnerable. One particularly unnerving incident occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. I was outside, tending to my small vegetable garden, a calming ritual that usually brought me peace. As I worked, a large, well-groomed German shepherd, clearly a purebred, came trotting into my yard. It wasn't wearing a collar. At first, I thought it was just lost, perhaps wandered from one of the new homes. I tried to coax it gently, offering it a piece of a carrot from my garden. But suddenly, a shrill, piercing whistle cut through the air. The dog instantly stopped, its ears perked, and then, without looking back, it ran off. Moments later, a woman's voice, loud and imperious, called out from beyond my property line. "Here, bandit. Bad dog. Stay out of that messy old yard." It was Patricia Albright's voice. She was walking her dog, off-leash, deliberately letting it wander onto my property, then calling it back with a subtle insult. It was a petty act, but it felt like a deliberate act of disrespect, a tiny invasion meant to remind me of her presence and her power. I started taking notes on all of these incidents, adding them to the growing pile of evidence Jessica had asked me to collect. Each disrupted night's sleep, each piece of misdirected mail, each encounter felt like a small jab, designed to wear me down. But instead of breaking me, it only strengthened my resolve. My grandparents had faced tougher times, and they had always met challenges with quiet dignity and unwavering strength. I would too. Jessica, meanwhile, was relentless. She had discovered several irregularities in the developer's permitting process. It turned out the initial rezoning for the Willow Creek Estates had been pushed through very quickly by the town council, with what Jessica suspected was insufficient review of the land survey maps. She found a critical detail, a minor change in the county's official mapping system from decades ago, a small adjustment that had, over time, been incorrectly interpreted by modern surveying software. This small, seemingly insignificant detail was the key to everything. The historical maps my grandfather had kept, the ones that painstakingly detailed every curve and tree, were based on the original, accurate county records, while the developers had relied on a newer, flawed interpretation that shifted the boundary line significantly in their favor. It was either a catastrophic oversight on their part or, as Jessica grimly suggested, a calculated gamble that I wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to challenge them. "This is huge, Alex," Jessica had explained during one of our calls, her voice buzzing with excitement. "The old county maps are legally binding. They relied on a revised, unofficial interpretation. It's a mistake, yes, but a massive one they should have caught. This confirms everything you've been saying. Your land is clearly demarcated, and their current development extends well beyond their legal boundaries. We have them." This news was a massive boost to my spirits, giving me the strength to endure the ongoing harassment. It was proof that my intuition, my family's legacy, was right. Jessica then took the next big step. She filed a formal quiet title action in court. This was a powerful legal move, essentially asking a judge to declare definitively who owned the disputed land. It was a clear, unambiguous challenge to Willow Creek Estates' very existence as it stood. The HOA and the development company reacted with a flurry of legal motions. They tried to get Jessica's quiet title action dismissed, arguing it was baseless. They hired even more expensive lawyers, a team of aggressive city attorneys from a large, well-known firm. They launched a counteroffensive of their own, filing motions to demand I pay for their legal fees, accusing me of vexatious litigation, essentially saying I was suing them just to be annoying. They even started spreading rumors in town, suggesting I was a bitter, anti-development eccentric who was trying to extort money from hard-working families. It was a smear campaign, designed to turn public opinion against me. But Jessica was ready for them. She expertly countered every motion, calmly presenting our meticulously gathered evidence to the court. She had the old surveys, the historical deeds, my photographs, and even the drone footage. She hired an independent surveyor, a highly respected professional named Michael, to conduct a brand new, extremely precise survey of my property based on the original county records. Michael's survey confirmed, down to the last inch, that my property lines were exactly where I claimed they were, and that a significant portion of Willow Creek Estates, including many homes and the entire community center, was indeed built squarely on my land. This new, independent survey, professionally sealed and certified, was our trump card. It was undeniable proof. Jessica filed it with the court, along with a detailed report from Michael explaining the error in the developer's modern maps. The moment that document landed on the judge's desk, the mood in the ongoing legal skirmishes changed. The developer's lawyers, once so confident, began to appear less assured. The dismissive tone in their legal letters began to soften, replaced by a strained formality. Then came the letters from the homeowners association itself. Not just Patricia Albright, but others, too. They weren't legal documents, but informal complaints, usually left tucked under a rock by my mailbox or slipped under my door. They accused me of being unneighborly, of holding up progress, of ruining property values. Some were surprisingly vicious, hinting at my isolation, implying that I was crazy. "Why are you doing this, Alex?" one handwritten note read. "Don't you care about people's homes?" It was clear the HOA was getting desperate, trying to use emotional manipulation to pressure me. One particularly aggressive incident occurred during a heat wave. It was July, and the temperatures were soaring into the high 90s. I relied on my well for water, and thankfully, it had always been reliable. But suddenly, my water pressure dropped to a trickle. I checked everything, the pump, the pipes. Nothing seemed outwardly wrong. After a day of barely having enough water to wash dishes, let alone take a proper shower, I discovered the problem. Someone had deliberately cut the power line to my well pump. The wires were cleanly severed, a deliberate act of sabotage, not an accident. There was no doubt in my mind that this was related to the ongoing dispute. It was a clear, malicious escalation, designed to make my life unbearable, to force me off my land. The act sent a chill down my spine far colder than the scorching summer heat. This was no longer just about property lines, it was about basic human decency, and it was clear that for some, those lines had been completely blurred. The severed power line to my well pump was a chilling escalation. It wasn't just a minor annoyance or a petty act of harassment, it was a direct attack on my ability to live on my own land. Without water, life in the farmhouse would become impossible. I stared at the cleanly cut wires, a cold fury bubbling inside me. This wasn't just about land anymore, it was about survival, about making me so miserable I'd simply give up and leave. But that was the one thing I absolutely would not do. My grandparents had taught me resilience, the quiet strength that came from knowing your purpose. I immediately called Jessica. Her voice, usually calm and steady, sharpened with concern when I described the sabotage. "Alex, this is serious. This crosses a line. Have you reported it to the police?" I had already tried. The local sheriff's department had been polite but unhelpful, saying that without direct witnesses or concrete proof, it was hard to investigate property damage, especially in the midst of a heated civil dispute. It was my word against an invisible assailant. Jessica advised me to get a temporary repair done quickly and to consider installing security cameras. It was an added expense I couldn't really afford, but the thought of another act of sabotage, or worse, someone actually breaking into my home, filled me with dread. I managed to fix the power line myself, thanks to some basic electrical knowledge my grandfather had taught me. The water flowed again, but the sense of security I once had was shattered. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every rustle in the woods, made me jump. I started sleeping with my old hunting rifle by my bed, something I hadn't done since my grandfather passed. It wasn't about hurting anyone, just about feeling a tiny bit safer in my own home. The legal battle intensified. Jessica pushed hard for a court date for the quiet title action, armed with Michael's definitive survey. The developer's lawyers fought back tooth and nail, using every delay tactic in the book. They filed motions to depose me for hours on end, asking invasive questions about my finances, my life, even my grandparents' history, clearly trying to find something, anything, to discredit me. I sat through it all, answering honestly, sometimes feeling exhausted and frustrated, but always remembering Jessica's firm advice: stay calm. Tell the truth. They're trying to break you. The news of the lawsuit, especially the part about the 75 homes being on my land, started to spread like wildfire among the new residents of Willow Creek Estates. Most of them had bought their dream homes, invested their life savings, and believed they were moving into a pristine, problem-free community. The idea that their houses might be on illegally acquired land was a terrifying prospect. Patricia Albright and the HOA tried to control the narrative. They sent out official-looking newsletters and emails to all residents, dismissing my lawsuit as baseless, a frivolous attempt by a disgruntled individual, and reassuring everyone that all legal matters are being handled by our expert team. They organized special, community update meetings, where Patricia herself would speak, projecting an air of absolute confidence, assuring the homeowners that their investment was safe. But some residents started to question. Whispers turned into murmurs, then into louder conversations. People started doing their own research, looking up county records, and comparing them to the HOA's reassurances. They saw the public filings of the quiet title action, saw Michael's survey report. The cracks in the HOA's confident facade began to show. Suddenly, it wasn't just me against the HOA, it was me, and a growing number of worried homeowners, against the HOA and the developers. I started receiving anonymous letters and emails from residents. Some were angry, accusing me of ruining their lives. "Why can't you just leave us alone?" one read. Others were curious, asking for more information. A few were surprisingly empathetic. "We didn't know," one email said. "We were told everything was legitimate. We feel terrible for you, and for us." It was a strange feeling, suddenly having these unseen allies, people who were also caught in Patricia Albright's legal web, albeit from a different angle. One afternoon, a new extreme event occurred, proving just how desperate Patricia Albright and the HOA had become. I was working in my shed, repairing an old bird feeder, when I heard a furious rapping at my front door. It wasn't the polite knock of a visitor. It was insistent, almost violent. I walked to the door and cautiously peered through the peephole. Standing on my porch were three people. Patricia Albright was there, her face contorted with rage, her usual polished demeanor completely gone. Beside her stood a tall, burly man I didn't recognize, dressed in a cheap suit, carrying a clipboard. And behind them, a stern-faced woman with a camera around her neck. Before I could even open the door, Patricia began shouting, her voice shrill and piercing. "Alex! Open this door right now. We know what you're doing." I opened the door, just a crack, holding it firmly. "Ms. Albright, you're on private property. What do you want?" "We know you're violating our covenants," she shrieked, gesturing wildly at my yard. "We've been getting complaints from residents. Your yard is unkempt. Your animals are running loose. My animals were a few friendly barn cats and a family of squirrels I sometimes fed. My yard was wild, yes, but it was natural, not unkempt. It was a deliberate misrepresentation. And we have a right to inspect the property adjacent to our development. This man is a building inspector. She gestured to the burly man. And she's here to document everything for the HOA. The building inspector stepped forward, trying to push past the door. Sir, we have received reports of code violations. We need to assess the situation. Code violations? I scoffed. On my own private land? I'm not part of your HOA. You have no authority here. And I certainly don't have any code violations. Oh, but you do. Patricia interjected, her voice dripping with malice. The way your driveway looks, the overgrown trees, the unpainted shed, these are all affecting the aesthetic of our community. And we have a new rule, passed unanimously by the HOA board: any property bordering Willow Creek Estates must adhere to our community standards for appearance and upkeep. If you don't comply, we will be forced to take action. Fines, liens, whatever it takes. It was an outrageous lie, a desperate attempt to force me into their rules. They couldn't just create a rule that applied to my property because it bordered theirs. It was legally impossible, a gross overreach of power. But the sheer audacity of it, the raw aggression in Patricia's eyes, was chilling. She was determined to make my life a living hell. The woman with the camera started snapping photos of my yard, my house, even me standing there, her flash going off repeatedly. It felt like a violation, an invasion of my privacy. Get off my property, I stated, my voice dangerously low, my patience finally snapping. All of you. Now. Or I will call the sheriff. Patricia Albright straightened, her eyes blazing. You think you're clever, Alex. You think your little lawsuit will stop us. But we will make your life a misery until you give up. You won't win this. We will find a way to make you regret this. You mark my words. She turned sharply and marched off my porch, the building inspector and the photographer scurrying behind her, leaving me standing there, trembling with a mixture of fear and absolute, unyielding defiance. The veiled threats, the attempted inspection, the deliberate provocation, it was clear they were going to use every dirty trick they could imagine. And I knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was just the beginning of their desperate attempts to intimidate me into submission. They were going to make my life a living nightmare until I broke. But I refused to break. Patricia Albright's retreating form, followed by her entourage of hired muscle and photographers, left me standing on my porch, trembling with a mixture of raw anger and growing apprehension. Their brazen attempt at an illegal inspection, coupled with the outlandish claim of enforcing HOA rules on my land, was a new low. It was clear their intimidation tactics were escalating, becoming more personal and desperate. The quiet strength my grandparents had instilled in me was being tested like never before, but their faces, their wise, kind eyes, flashed in my mind, reminding me of the promise I had made. I wouldn't break. The weeks that followed felt like a slow, agonizing siege. The strange occurrences intensified. My mailbox was vandalized, spray-painted with crude, threatening messages. Someone drove a rusty pickup truck onto my lawn one night, doing donuts and tearing up the grass before speeding away. I found dead animals, small birds and a rabbit, left on my doorstep, macabre warnings. My phone number, which was unlisted, somehow started getting calls from unknown numbers at all hours, with silence on the other end or vague, muffled threats. Each incident chipped away at my peace, making me feel constantly exposed, constantly watched. I installed the security cameras Jessica had suggested, and while they didn't stop the harassment entirely, they offered a sliver of reassurance, proof that these were indeed targeted attacks. Jessica, meanwhile, was a force of nature in the courtroom. She used every one of their aggressive tactics against them. When they deposed me for hours, she had me recount every incident of harassment, every sleepless night, every act of vandalism. She presented the police reports, the photos, the video footage from my new cameras. She argued passionately that their aggressive legal maneuvers and personal attacks were clear evidence of their bad faith and desperate attempts to conceal their initial error. The judge, a stoic woman named Judge Thompson, listened patiently, her expression unreadable, but I could feel a shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. The developers' lawyers, once so confident, now looked increasingly uncomfortable. The internal strife within Willow Creek Estates was also reaching a boiling point. The initial news of the lawsuit had caused a stir, but the confirmed independent survey from Michael, proving that houses were indeed on my land, sent shockwaves through the community. Residents who had invested their life savings were furious. They began to question Patricia Albright's leadership, demanding answers. Whispers of a class action lawsuit against the developer and the HOA by the homeowners themselves began to circulate. Some residents, no longer swayed by Patricia's reassurances, started contacting Jessica directly, sharing information and expressing their fear and anger. They had been lied to, and their dream homes were now legally compromised. The financial pressure on the HOA mounted. Legal fees were astronomical. The ongoing construction delays due to the injunction were costing the developers millions. Property sales in Willow Creek Estates ground to a halt as word spread about the legal dispute. No one wanted to buy a house that might be embroiled in a complex property ownership battle. The shiny new community, once a symbol of success, was becoming a financial sinkhole. Then came the day the truth finally started to unravel publicly. Jessica had pushed for an expedited hearing on the quiet title action, arguing that the ongoing harassment and the severe impact on both me and the Willow Creek residents necessitated a swift resolution. Judge Thompson agreed. The courtroom was packed. Not just with the lawyers and a few reporters, but with dozens of Willow Creek homeowners, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Patricia Albright and her legal team, who sat looking increasingly isolated. Jessica presented her case with calm, irrefutable logic. She displayed the original county maps, the meticulously detailed land surveys from my grandfather, and Michael's certified report. She showed how the developer's modern maps had, at some point, misread or ignored a critical survey point, effectively shifting the perceived boundary line, stealing acres of my land without anyone realizing it, or perhaps, without caring. She displayed aerial photographs from my drone, starkly contrasting my untouched land with the encroaching development, clearly showing houses and the community center standing proudly on what was legally my property. Then, she called a surprise witness. Robert Miller, a former land surveyor who had briefly worked for the Willow Creek Estates development company during its early planning stages. Robert, a nervous man with a tired face, testified that he had, in fact, noticed the discrepancy in the older county maps versus the newer ones they were using. He had brought it to the attention of his supervisor, who had dismissed his concerns, telling him to stick to the plans we were given and that they had bigger fish to fry than worrying about some old farmer's forgotten land. His testimony was a bombshell, proving that the developers were aware of potential issues but chose to ignore them. Patricia Albright's face drained of all color, her eyes darting nervously between Robert and the furious faces of the homeowners. The final, most extreme moment came when Jessica, with a dramatic flair, unrolled the enormous, court-certified survey map for the entire courtroom to see. With a laser pointer, she traced the true boundary lines of my property, as proven by the historical records and Michael's survey. Then, she overlaid it with the developer's official map of Willow Creek Estates. The overlap was horrifyingly clear, not just a few houses, but 75 homes. Their very existence, their manicured lawns, their driveways, their septic systems, were undeniable, irrevocably built on land that did not belong to the developer, and therefore, did not belong to the homeowners. And there, squarely in the middle of my land, where my grandfather's oak tree stood encircled by a white picket fence, was the gleaming outline of the Willow Creek Estates Community Center. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by an angry, chaotic murmur. Homeowners sprang to their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. My house is on his land? What about our mortgages? This is fraud. Patricia Albright, who had maintained a facade of composure until that moment, completely crumbled. Her face contorted, she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Her legal team, looking utterly defeated, exchanged panicked whispers. Judge Thompson, gaveling for order, finally spoke, her voice cutting through the uproar. Given the overwhelming and irrefutable evidence presented, including the historical deeds, the multiple verified surveys, and the testimony of Mr. Miller, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Alex, in the quiet title action. The boundaries of his property are definitively established as presented. She paused, letting her words sink in. Furthermore, the court finds that Willow Creek Estates, and by extension, its homeowners association, have indeed constructed numerous structures, including residential homes and a community center, on land that legally belongs to Mr. Alex. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The homeowners, initially furious, now looked utterly devastated. Their dreams, their financial stability, were shattered. Patricia Albright looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, utterly broken. Her reign of petty tyranny and dismissive arrogance had led to an unimaginable disaster. She had built her kingdom, not on the rock of legal truth, but on the quicksand of misinformation and deliberate disregard for boundaries. And now, the entire structure was collapsing. The judge continued, her voice grave. The ramifications of this ruling are profound. The court will now move to determine appropriate remedies, which could include, but are not limited to, significant damages, the potential for forced removal of structures, or other substantial legal actions to restore Mr. Alex's property rights. This is a complex matter, and further hearings will be scheduled to address the equitable solutions for all parties involved. As the judge's words echoed, I looked at Patricia Albright. The HOA Karen who had scorned my quiet life, who had tried to intimidate and sabotage me, who had so confidently declared my land was hers, was now staring into an abyss of her own making. Her 75 homes, her entire grand vision, were now tangled in my legal web, caught in a catastrophe of her own creation. The battle was far from over, but the victory was undeniable. My land, my grandparents' legacy, was vindicated. And the real consequences, for everyone involved, were only just beginning to unfold.